We are now going to move on to the lightning round of questions, which we have set aside 15 minutes for. As a reminder, each candidate has 30 seconds to answer these questions. Our first question for the lightning round is: the pandemic has been a time of great change and learning. What is one lesson from the pandemic you want to make sure we don't forget moving forward? For our next response, I'd like to invite Ms. Ramachandran.
An injury to one is an injury to all, as the union slogan goes. We cannot overlook any single member of our community as far as healthcare, wages, housing, in order to protect all of us. One of the strongest lessons that I'm going to take forward, that I hope all of us take forward, is remembering the fact that 3 million Californians could not pay rent during this pandemic. And 2 days after this special election, our statewide eviction moratorium is lifted. That has not been getting the coverage that it deserves to, and there are 3 million Californians that are going to be threatened to be evicted from their homes.
Thank you, Mr. Ramachandran. For our next response, I'm going to turn it over to Director Bonta.
I think the biggest lesson learned from COVID is that we can't hide from racial inequity and economic inequity. And when we have pandemics like COVID hit us, we see all too starkly the ways in which we have not been supportive of our community. We learned that when we close our schools, we close down our economy, and we learned that the best way to be able to get resources is to listen to the people who are most directly impacted, and that our state legislation needs to ensure that we're centering the people who know how to solve the problem in terms of financial support and resources delivered.
Thank you, Director Bonta. The 18th Assembly District has a diverse community that lives within its confines. What is one specific and unique thing you will do to promote and protect equity for our BIPOC communities? Ms. Ramachandran, please go ahead.
I would highlight equity in contracting. Black businesses in Oakland have lost over $40 million, according to the Racial Equities Disparities Report last year, due to inequity in contracting. And our Black and Brown and minority-owned businesses deserve equal opportunities as their white counterparts. Especially coming out of this pandemic, we need to make sure that our small business community is able to grow and thrive, and that starts with making sure minority businesses are uplifted.
Thank you, Ms. Ramachandran. For our next response, Director Bonta, please go ahead.
I would ensure that we eliminate Prop 209, which has subsequently not allowed us to be able to recognize that racial equity is based in understanding that race and ethnicity actually matter in this state. It's been the core issue and the core concern for making sure that we as BIPOC communities are not able to receive the health, education, economic, and workforce justice that we need. And I would ensure that we focus on that. I would also be a Black Latina supporting the Black Caucus as well as the Legislative Latino Caucus in the California State Legislature.
Thank you, Director Bonta.
Everyone, now we're going to get into the deep, substantive questions. So there will be 90 seconds for response of each candidate. And the question is, there recently has been a variety of legislation introduced intended to reform policing, such as a bill that would allow anyone to run for sheriff. What would you do as Assembly member on the topic of police reform? Director Bonta?
First and foremost, we need to continue to allow and enable municipalities to reallocate funds from our police force to our care force to ensure that our first responders for many crimes are related for calls that we get are for people who are experiencing issues that need care instead of issues that need force in the way that we do that. We also need to support our municipalities in generating out a police oversight committee so that we have a community that has police who are accountable to our community members. We need to ensure that we introduce more bias training to our police officers and give them the tools and the restrictions so that they're not using holds that actually lead to the death of our people. And finally, we need to make sure that we remove the immunities that allow people, police officers, when they are engaging in misconduct and crime, to ensure that they are accountable for the commissions and acts of misconduct that they commit against our community members. And finally, we need to ensure that we have a strong victims' rights and victims' justice opportunity, so that when we do have police encounters and our community suffers, that our family members don't continue to suffer and have to wait too long to ensure that they have justice that they need in support of their families.
Thank you, Director Bonta. Next, we have Ms. Ramachandran.
1,172 people were murdered last year due to police brutality, and extremely few killer cops got anything more than a slap on the wrist. I would fight for three things. First, SB 2, hopefully it's passed by then, but I strongly support decertifying officers who have committed harm, because it is unfair that police officers who are fired from police departments like OPD go because of misconduct and violence and even murder, then go get jobs in Vallejo and Modesto. Second, I would eliminate the police Bill of Rights, because cops are not above the law. We need to expand on Nancy Skinner's SB 1141, so it's not so difficult to actually get police records, and people can get full transparency. And finally, we need alternatives to the criminal justice system. As a lifelong advocate for survivors of domestic violence and people experiencing mental health crisis, I have seen how police are not the answers to community violence. More training for cops does not work. 60% of Cal OES fundings for survivors of abuse goes to cops and prosecutors, yet 80% of survivors find the police harmful or entirely unhelpful. We need to reinvest through bills along the lines of the Crisis Act into restorative justice programs, into culturally competent mental health services, into youth-based healing to provide not just a Band-Aid on community violence, but actual getting to roots of violence.
Thank you, Ms. Ramachandran. Okay, our next question. California is facing a housing shortage, resulting in housing costs that are out of reach for most California, with disproportionate impact on low-income communities and women. While some parts of our district are building housing, statewide housing bills to address both supply and tenant protections are frequently killed by other Democrats, especially those representing Southern California. How will you work with and convince your Southern California Democratic colleagues to fight for the large-scale zoning reforms and tenant protections that California needs to protect Californians while creating responsible growth? Director Bonta?
Thank you. So the question was how we would actually work with our legislators. The question was how we would actually work with fellow legislators to be able to pass a reform. I think one of the critical pieces is to recognize and have everybody in the state recognize that this housing crisis is something that all of us need to address, and we all need to do our fair share to make that happen. That goes for housing production, preservation, and protection of tenants' rights. I think one of the issues that we always have is in housing production. We know that we need to be able to produce more affordable housing, and a lot of the housing production bills that we have certainly produce housing, not necessarily produce affordable housing. And that's a central piece that I think our Southern California legislators need to be able to support. We also need to ground the conversation in terms of the impact of housing on the environment and the way in which we can actually build housing that supports our environmental considerations. And finally, we need to ensure with our fellow legislators that tenants' rights, given the fact that there are 18 million tenants in the state of California, are fully protected with any legislation that comes before us. We often have legislation that addresses one aspect of the three Ps, but not necessarily all. And in order to be able to truly solve the housing crisis that we have, we need to ensure that everybody is at the table, everybody is cognizant and focused on doing their fair share, and that we are centering our housing production as well as tenant protection.
Thank you, Director Bonta. Ms. Ramachandran?
Yes, I was part of the coalition that fought for AB 15 and a stronger eviction moratorium that our very own Democrats killed. And yet when debating SB 91, our current eviction moratorium that is expiring 2 days after the special election, when debating that bill, there was a Republican on the floor saying, "I don't care if this is a Democratic issue. I care that my constituents are being evicted in the middle of a pandemic. How is that fair? And that just shows that we can find common ground across the board, not so much between corporate Democrats and non-corporate Democrats, but between anyone that cares about their constituents, anyone with districts where there are a significant number of tenants, and those who are not. And as far as upzoning goes, the argument to naysayers is simple: economics. The less we build, the less supply is going to meet demand, the more land prices and housing prices are going to go up. We can also start electing more tenants and people pro-tenant policies. There are 34 assembly seats available next year. A significant number of those seats are because legislators are termed out. We can start now in this very special election by electing a tenant themselves, because right now we only have 3 in a legislature with 120 lawmakers. 60% of this assembly district are tenants. It's time we're represented by one.
Thank you, Ms. Ramachandran. The next question. The COVID-19 pandemic placed a huge burden on families, with mothers bearing the brunt of that burden. Many women left their jobs in order to take on unexpected childcare needs, which will likely create a generational impact on our workforce and on women's independence. What bills do you plan to introduce in the state legislature that will create workforce equity and help increase those women's labor force participation? Director Bonta?
We need to ensure that our mothers can be mothers and workers, and that women are paid for their value, which has not been the case. Certainly hasn't been the case with the lack of passage of the ERA, for instance, in our country. We need to ensure that we have a stronger pathway for women to be able to onboard, to ramp up and off ramp as they need in order to be able to take care of their families and take care of themselves, by ensuring that we have compensation packages and benefits packages that are protected by employers, to be able to extend the ability of people to take the time that they need to support their families, and to have the adequate health care in order to be able to do so. Women take care of the world. We take care of our children, we take care of our families, and we take care of our communities. And we need to ensure that we have the ability to have equity in pay, which has not been the case. We need to ensure that we have equity in healthcare. We need to make sure that the bias that we face in our healthcare is provided to us, so that is something that is eliminated, so that we can actually receive the healthcare that we need. And we need to ensure that we have childcare and childcare workers who actually paid fairly for the critical work that they do, so that women can work, they can take care of their children, and they can take care of their community, as we have always done. As a working mother of 3, who has always had to juggle work and taking care of my family, I think it's absolutely critical that we ensure that women are cared for, particularly during COVID.
Thank you, Director Bonta. Ms. Ramachandran?
I believe we need to do 3 things, because women are leaving the workforce and forced out of the workforce at significant levels throughout the course of this pandemic. 3 days of paid sick leave is all we get right now. I was involved in working with the California Working Families Coalition for advocating for 10 days as a part of SB 1383. That got reduced to 5 and ultimately down to 3. I fought for the right to job protection, because the significant population of Californians who should be allowed to get paid sick leaves because they pay into state disability don't, because they're afraid of losing their job, because there's not job protection for over 5 million California workers who could have access to it. So I would introduce bills to expand the number of paid sick days from 3 to anything more than that, because that's unacceptable. I also advocated for, during the pandemic, AB 3216, the right to retention, to have jobs back in the most heavily impacted industries due to COVID. That was unfortunately vetoed by our governor, and I believe that, and I would work to get that back, to make sure our most heavily impacted industries have the right to get their job. I also believe in raising the minimum wage. The core foundation of my political platform is a $22 minimum wage. However, I recognize that 35% of Californians don't even make $15 an hour, and the majority of that 35% are women of color. So we need to start thinking about the inequities there, and then moving forward to an equitable higher minimum wage.
Thank you, Ms. Ramachandran. Okay, and for the final question, the cost of living in, sorry, the final question of this round, to clarify. The cost of living in the East Bay continues to rise higher and higher, and incomes are not keeping up. It is becoming harder and harder to pay bills and cover grocery costs for many. The idea of saving to buy a house here is a pipe dream. What will you do in Sacramento to ensure the East Bay remains open and accessible to working class families and will not become just another playground for millionaires? Director Bonta?
As the daughter of somebody who did have a woman who worked every single day, but did experience not being able to have enough income to keep a house over a roof over our head with that kind of certainty. This is, I think, what I and many of us are experiencing still today, every single day. It's a pretty simple equation. We need to make sure that we're raising our wages, reducing the cost of living, particularly as it relates to healthcare, and reducing the cost of living and increasing the affordable housing that we can, so that we can stay in our homes and stay a part of our community. The way to be able to raise wages is to ensure that we raise the minimum wage. I've certainly been able to do that, thankfully, in the school board context, in the school district context, by ensuring that we were able to raise the minimum wage for our classified staff to $15 an hour, far outpacing the schedule that California set on. We need to do that across the board in the state of California. Secondarily, we need to ensure that ancillary costs like healthcare, which shouldn't be ancillary, is a right that we should all have, are not driving us to be able to make decisions between paying medical care or for prescriptions because they're too expensive. And finally, we need to ensure that we bring in affordable housing in the ways that we've talked about them before. And at the end of the day, ensuring that tenants in that affordable housing are a critical part of the equation, so that we don't make sure that we can't afford to stay in our community.
Ms. Ramachandran?
Yeah, the rent might be too high, but the reality is wages are also too damn low. If wages had increased at the rate of productivity in this country, we would be at a national $23 an hour. So I fully support raising the minimum wage in California to, at the very least, $22 an hour, because we have the 5th largest economy in the world, yet we have the highest rate of real poverty. Taxpayers have subsidized the ability of large corporations to underpay their workers, force them to go on food stamps, force people to need to work multiple jobs just to make ends meet. And it's time that we stop allowing corporations to reap the benefits of our hard-earned money. We should also utilize our $75 billion surplus, not to give exceptions to small businesses, but to allow and enable small businesses to pay their workers living wages. The vast majority, almost every small business owner that I know would love to pay their workers a living wage if they were able to. And as a state, we should have a responsibility to enable them to do so. The other policy I would enact is a wealth tax on all those who make over who have financial assets of over $50 billion, and use this funding to better fund affordable housing, a Green New Deal, and Medicare for all, because even with the federal waiver, we're going to be in about a $40 billion shortfall in order to implement a single-payer healthcare system.
Thank you, Ms. Ramachandran. And that completes the substantive round. I will now move it over to Lance Kwan of the South Alameda County Young Democrats for audience questions. Thank you.
All right. Well, our first audience question, this is actually in light of today, from just a general club basis, we were all thinking it. So today reminded us again how the common sense of a clear majority of our Bay Area constituents on gun violence policy doesn't easily translate to national or even statewide politics. How would you work to be effective in the urgent matter of our current gun violence and mass murder epidemic?
We've lost so many lives, and we just can't seem to do anything but offer hopes and prayers to be able to end mass gun violence. I think we have a slew of smart gun violence and gun sense laws in the waiting, and we have many advocates in our field, in our sector, who have been fighting for that, like Mothers for Justice. So I think that we need to focus on eliminating the ability to have high caliber weapons, to be able to eliminate automatic weapons, make them not available to our community anymore. They just need to be taken away. We need to be able to offer up opportunities for people to surrender their guns and remove them from our community. We need to be able to ensure that we have a high consequence for people who use guns and high caliber weapons in our community, and be strong on making sure that we take the guns off of our streets, offer amnesty programs to be able to allow for that to happen as much as possible, and ensure that we have the ability to protect our victims when they are subject to gun violence in a way that ensures that we're centering our victims in this moment.
Right, and Janani Ramachandran.
Every 3 hours, a Californian dies from a gunshot wound. As someone who has lost a family member due to gun violence, this actually truly touches home. Black people are twice as likely to be killed and 14 times more likely to be injured by a gun than their white counterparts. Domestic violence abusers are 5 times more likely to kill their partners. So the things that I believe are going to get to the root of the issue include storage regulations, state laws that require guns to be locked or kept in a secure storage container at all times, not just in some circumstances like current law says. Background checks for ammunition purchases, eliminating bump stocks, better regulating the 38 gun dealers we have in Alameda County, strengthening the efficacy and usage of gun violence restraining orders that are significantly underutilized. And beyond this, we need to get to the root of gun violence, prevent, not just intervene after the harm already happens. And this includes investing in education, after-school programs, school-based mental health services, restorative justice program, prevention initiatives like the Hope and Healed Fund. And finally, we need to invest in better gun violence research and support organizations like the Gifford Center, the Davis Firearm Institute, the Education Fund to Stop Gun Violence, Williams Institute in UCLA, and so many more.
The next question for all of the candidates, Selena Reyes asks, with so many important issues that the state needs to deal with, what is your #1 priority for the first 90 days in office? You have 1 minute to respond, starting with Mia Bonta.
I think this moment requires us to be focused on COVID relief and recovery and ensuring that we have the opportunity to take the funds that have been available to us through the federal stimulus and the state stimulus really applied. My focus will be to ensure that the funds that we are receiving are actually directed at people who know what needs to happen, that we're responding to first responders and frontline responders for COVID relief and recovery moving forward. That should be what is all consuming for every single legislator over the next several months, because what we are experiencing will have generational impacts on our communities.
And finally, Janani Ramachandran.
My very first act in the legislature would be to extend and expand our existing eviction moratorium, which I will repeat for a 3rd time today, ends the very day, I was mistaken earlier, not 2 days, June 31st does not exist, after the special election. 3 million Californians cannot afford rent next month, and thousands will also lose homes due to foreclosures. 40% of tenants in California had no access to our absolutely flawed rental relief program under SB 91, which prioritizes the interests of large corporate landlords over the interests of tenants, and even prioritizes the interests of small and nonprofit landlords over those who aren't. When people are evicted, they get displaced from their neighborhoods and their communities. And if someone's displaced in Oakland and is a long-term rent control tenant, it is extremely unlikely that they're going to be able to stay in Oakland the way our system works. So we need to do everything to protect the rights of tenants to stay in their neighborhoods, period.
Wildfire season only gets worse every single year. What do you think some of the solutions that California should strive for to lessen and mitigate the impacts of wildfire season? Starting off with Mia Bonta.
I think we need to ensure that we're investing in vegetation clearing that would allow for us to be able to remove the brush that causes wildfires. I think we need to focus on making sure that we're doing more planting so that we have fewer dry vegetation causing wildfires. I think we need to invest significantly in ensuring that we're bringing on more firefighters to be able to support and address the wildfire season when it happens. And I think we need to ensure that we have the ability to just have more force out with preventative measures to eliminate the possibility of wildfires over time, because it is the thing that is causing us to not be able to have the kind of environmental health and with the emission of carbon dioxides to be able to reduce emissions for our planet.
Finally, Janani Ramachandran.
Yeah, I believe we need to do 3 key things. First, proactive wildfire mitigation through methods like expanding irrigation, controlled burns, removing invasive plants that are drought prone and essentially tinder for fire. 2, we need to hold PG&E accountable, as James just said. PG&E has been held criminally responsible for recklessly endangering people's lives by poorly maintained grills. And yet this investor-owned utility, 94% of our state legislators accept corporate contributions from. We need to move towards a state-owned grid, subsidized by our general fund. And third, we need to bolster resiliency. We're not going to overturn climate change overnight, so we need to make sure that the communities who suffer the greatest impact from the climate crisis and wildfires in particular, who have to deal with the acute impacts and temporary displacement, are provided for and are supported by our state.
All right, thank you. The next question comes from Michael Carbruno, sorry. Who are your key endorsers, like unions, clubs, and other organizations? And what financial and organizational resources do you have to run a competitive race in this assembly district, seeing that you get elected every 2 years? We're going to start off with Mia Bonta.
I'm proud to have a broad coalition of support from unions, the California School Employees Association, CTA, SCIU California, the California Professional Firefighters, UFCW Local 5, and the California Faculty Association, as well as AFSCME Local 206, UAPD. I'm proud to have the endorsement and support of Senator Alex Padilla, Treasurer Fiona Ma, Secretary of State Shirley Weber. Proud to have the endorsement of California State Legislative Black Caucus, California State Legislative State Latino Caucus, and many local leaders, including city council members in Oakland, Treva Reed, Noel Gallo, Lauren Taylor, and Sheng Tao. And most proud of the endorsements that I've received from our school board members, our student school board members in particular, sorry, the 15 minutes. Henry Mills, school board members, Jessica Ramos, and William Lau, and thank you. I'll stop there.
All right, thank you so much. All right, and then finally, Janani.
Yeah, I'm proud to have the endorsement of Our Revolution East Bay, Indivisible East Bay, Sunrise Movement Bay Area, ILWU's Northern California District Council, Harvey Milk LGBTQ Democratic Club, LGBTQ Women's Fund, Oakland Tenants Union, Enact Universal Healthcare, among other organizations, Progressive Heroes, including Assemblymember Alex Lee, and 8 Oakland-based faith leaders, 12 current and former city council members. And while I'll never outspend my competitors in this race, I am running an incredibly strong grassroots campaign. And if there's anything recent history shows, it's that boots on the ground, willpower, and courage can actually win. I have the highest number of individual donors, over 500, and 250 volunteer, most of whom heard about the campaign, got excited, and came on board. And that's how we win a people-powered movement.
All right. Next question to the floor. And I think this might be the last question here, actually, because we're starting to run out of time. Laws that increase criminal penalties for gun, or asked by Margaret LaCobb, sorry. Laws that increase criminal penalties for gun possession are likely to be mostly well enforced against Black and Latino members of our community, and as criminal laws in general. How do you reconcile your views on gun control with your views on mass incarceration? We're going to start off with Mia Bonta.
I agree with the questioner in this. I think we need to be able to ensure that we focus on amnesty in making sure that we have pathways to be able to surrender weapons and ensure that we get our weapons off the street so that they stop killing our Black and brown brothers and sisters. And I do think that there's a disproportionate impact on any law and any criminal law on African and Latino children and youth and members of our community. So it's absolutely critical that we balance and place first a lens around ensuring that we're not criminalizing poverty, not criminalizing race and ethnicity, and ensuring that we pass sensible gun laws that get our gun laws off of the streets, while also ensuring that we are not hindering our ability for our Black and brown brothers and sisters to be able to live freely in our community.
Yeah, our carceral system costs about $50 billion, which is close to what we spend on K through 12 education. We need to start by eliminating sentence enhancements, increasing off-ramps for people who are convicted, who were tried as adults when they were youth, or criminalized for being survivors of human trafficking or domestic violence, all of whom are much more likely to be Black and brown youth than any other set of individuals. We also need to pass Ash Color's Racial Justice Act 2.0, AB 256, in order to expand protections to individuals charged with a crime due to racial bias. We also need to restructure our parole board. Only 16% of individuals receive parole when requested, in direct contradiction to the legislative intent of our statutory presumption a few decades ago. We need to expand reentry services, enforce non-discrimination in not only employment. Ban the Box was great, but we need to implement that in housing as well.
All right, we're going to be moving into closing remarks. So that's going to be moderated by our East Bay Stonewall representative, Joe Cruz.
Great. So each candidate will have 1 minute for closing statements. And before we dive in, I just want to thank you all for your really thoughtful answers to all those questions. It's been really great to hear from each of you. So I just posted the order in the chat, and we'll start with Janani. Go ahead for 1 minute.
Yeah. I'm running for state assembly because I am inspired by the stories of individuals that I've worked with who have been failed time and time and again by our criminal justice system, people who have been evicted from their homes in the middle of a pandemic, people who have been shut out of healthcare, and everyone who has been denied true economic opportunity. I want to work alongside all of you to enact the policies that are going to push the needle to achieve true gender, racial, and economic justice. Join the progressive leaders who believe in the movement that our campaign is starting, including the Sunrise Movement, Our Revolution, the Harvey Milk Club, ILWU, Oakland Tenants Union, Indivisible East Bay, and so many more. Together, we can build the coalitions that we need to pass the progressive reforms. It is not impossible to pass a $22 minimum wage if we work together. It is not impossible to enact a Green New Deal with the racial equity lens if we actually build bridges across the board, work together, enact progressive leaders. Join me at www.janani4ca.com. Thank you.
Mia, you're up next for 1 minute. Go ahead.
Today certainly makes us be aware of all of the work that we need to do as it relates to gun violence, protecting our humanity and protecting our communities. We have work to do, California. We have work to do, fellow neighbors. We need to ensure that we have an ability to have an equitable and transformational COVID recovery. This is an opportunity of a lifetime to be able to take something from some of the most devastating moments that we've had to suffer through together over the last 18 months and turn that into transformational change for our community in California. we need to be able to address, and I'm looking forward to going after the core root issues that are impacting our homeless neighbors and the housing crisis that we're facing. And finally, we need to make sure that we can reopen our schools with everything that we have to ensure that we can reopen our economy. I'm running for state assembly because I know that I can roll up my sleeves, get in there and get the job done for our district in a way that embodies our progressive values, that in a way that ensures that we have activists' hearts put to public service. Thank you for putting this forum together. It's been an incredible time to spend with you.
Thank you. Appreciate that. And